Welcome to the Pfizer Podcast. My name is Louise Duffy, and in this series, we will explore how to prepare for an interview for the role of consultant or specialist registrar. In this third episode, I speak to Dr. Edmund Smith, consultant microbiologist at Beaumont Hospital, and Dr. Yvonne Barnes-Holmes, psychologist with Perspectives Ireland. We discuss the approach and expectations of an interview panel for a consultant or specialist registrar role, as well as self-care and stress management on approach to the interview. I'm delighted to be joined now by Dr. Edmund Smith, consultant microbiologist at Beaumont Hospital. Now, we've talked in previous episodes about the ways that candidates can prepare for a consultant or specialist registrar role, and we're going to delve into this a little deeper with Dr. Smith. So, Doctor, you've worked in the industry for many years and you've sat on many panels for interviews at this level. In your opinion, what would make a candidate stand out when performing for a consultant or specialist registrar interview?
I suppose the first thing to say is that if you've got past the shortlisting stage, you're almost certainly appointable. So almost everybody who comes for interview could be appointed. And so in order to stand out, you've got to bring something that's a bit special, a bit different. And I think there's probably maybe the most important of those is some evidence that you've, in your training or in your previous job, in your preparation, that you've taken something and run with it. An example might be a service that you helped develop, that you troubleshooted, that you set up, and giving examples of how you did it and how you moved from where you were to where you wanted to be and who you needed to bring with you. Doing that with examples rather than being aspirational about you would do this or you would do that, I think is very powerful. It shows evidence of having achieved. I think then the next thing is, and this is really important, I think, being excited, being enthusiastic, bringing energy, bringing vitality to what's often quite a hard job. I mean, you will be aware, obviously, on the other side of the table that it's very tough, it's very challenging. But it's also challenging for the interviewers as well, because not only do they have to sit through a number of interviews, the same questions being asked, but they're also conscious of how the other people sitting around the table are assessing them. Because this goes on all the time, who's that, what's that Twit Smith asking that question about, where is he going with that? And God, he'd think of something better. So what you want to do as an interviewer is you want to a degree impress your peers around the interview table and see that you've actually elicited an enthusiastic and impressive response from a candidate. So it's sort of a two-way exercise. It also brightens the atmosphere because it means that if you've got somebody across the table who's full of energy, full of vitality, it just makes everybody a lot more responsive, a lot more positive towards that person.
Tell me about that questioning style, what a candidate could expect.
Well, it's very much competency-based nowadays. So the typical pattern will be the chair will take you through the CV. So talk us through your training, and depending on what level of job it is, if it's a very senior job, it might be more talk us through, the highlights of your career, because it might not be possible to go, if you're applying for a chair or something, to go through, 10 years of experience as a consultant in different places. Take it in the context of using it, even if they don't phrase it in this way, of you highlighting the things of which you're most proud in your CV. So if you won the Corrigan Medal, even though it was back when you were an SHO in medicine, doing your MRCPI, winning the Corrigan Medal is something really important. It is something to be proud of, even, 8 or 9 years later when you're applying for a consultant job. On the other hand, you don't really want to be talking about your leaving cert because it's fairly irrelevant. So pick out the things that you're proudest of and that also illustrate the extent and the breadth of your training and your experience. And then the chair will tell you what's going to happen. So-and-so will walk you through your CV. So-and-so will ask you about your approach to research. So-and-so will ask you about your clinical experience and what you expect from the clinical side of this job. Somebody else will ask you about management. And then you'll be asked the same questions as the other candidates, and they'll generally be open-ended questions. And I think what the panel is looking for is examples. They want to see, here is somebody who doesn't just talk the talk, but has walked the walk as well. That they can illustrate examples of, dealing with the difficult colleague, not in theory, but giving a real live example of where you had to do that, illustrating all of your answers with examples, I think is very important. And you'll often have the kinder interview will often smile encouragingly when they like what you're hearing. The stony-faced person won't. And so you'll have both kinds around the table. And sometimes, you're asked a question by the stony-faced individual who's not going to give you any clue as to whether you're going the right direction. But by looking at others around the table, you may get some signs of encouragement. So I think that's also quite helpful. It's also very reasonable if you don't quite grasp. Now, you can't do this too often, but it's quite reasonable to say you don't quite get the question, you don't quite grasp the question, or would you mind repeating that? Now, you can't say that all repeatedly because you come across as, oh God, not only are they deaf, but they're also a bit stupid as well. But you can do it in the context of giving yourself a little bit of time to think about what might be a reasonable approach to this particularly tricky question. Use it sparingly, as I say, but it can be deployed.
And then in terms of, your experience on a panel, what are some of the key mistakes you've seen candidates making?
I think not answering the question is probably the most important. You really do have to listen to what you've been asked. And you may have a script going in about the points you want to get across and the issues you want to highlight. And you can do that, when you're talking through your CV and your training and so forth. But I think you really do have to answer the question. You have to think, what exactly are they asking me here? And you need to answer it in the broadest possible way. You can prattle on, and you can actually speak a lot of sense. But if you're not answering the question, it doesn't count for very much. You have a short amount of time to think about how you're going to approach it. You don't need to open your mouth straight away. You've got a moment or two to gather your thoughts, and then you start. So I think that's probably the most important thing. And then I think it's important, your not so much your appearance, but your demeanor. If you sit back, flung back in the chair, you're not looking hungry. You're looking complacent. If you lean forward, you're listening, you're engaging. You want somebody to be interested in the interview panel. You want them to be clearly listening. And so I think, leaning forward a little bit, keeping your hands under control, watch for your body language and your body tics, watch for your attention. I interviewed a candidate I know very well some years ago, and one of the things I knew about this person was that when they got tense, and I had seen this because I'd worked with this person, they had trained in our department, I could see when they got tense that they flushed, and they flushed from the top of their shirt up to their sort of jawline. It went puce red. And this person had insight into that. And I was amused to see that the last time I interviewed this person, they wore a scarf. And so you couldn't see it. They were aware of the body language that they were giving off. So think about your body language. And if you don't have professional, training course, do it with some colleagues, do it at home. Get yourself into the frame of mind of being asked questions and thinking about the answers and, your demeanor and all that stuff. Try and come across as committed and enthusiastic and patient-focused and collegiate. Those are the things you want in a colleague. You want somebody who, above all, cares about patient care, who's going to be enthusiastic and hardworking and committed and has got the evidence of that in almost de facto by being on the other side of the table.
I'm now joined by psychologist Dr. Yvonne Barnes-Holmes, co-founder of Perspectives Ireland. Now, Yvonne, we've been discussing the importance of preparation when it comes to interviews, particularly preparing your answers and practicing. Now, very often those preparing for job interviews become naturally concerned with the content of their answers. How important is it to prepare your mindset in advance of a job interview?
I think it's actually more important than the content because you actually can't take the content out of context. If you think of all of the psychological and behavioral steps and sort of mental steps that would surround or happen in advance of that actual content, to be honest, it's the scaffolding around the content that will allow the content to be really secure or even any sort of slips to be adjusted for. So it perhaps seems a little ironic, but the actual scaffolding and the structure that surrounds the content is far more important and far more influential than the content than I think most people really realize.
And so is there any guidance you can give to somebody to prepare their mindset or to try and find that perspective?
I mean, I think the first thing to do is just remind yourself of all the things that you did that got you to this point, and remind yourself of the fact that they worked. You're actually now at this point for a reason, because whatever you've done before, even getting, to this career, or getting to this point in your career, or just filling out the application form or whatever it is, that you got here because you actually already did very well. That's the first thing in terms of that very early preparation. And the second thing in that sort of broader mindset piece is just remind yourself why you're doing this. Why does this matter to you? What do you really want to achieve from this, and how much it matters to you will then help reflect in how much effort you're prepared to put into it, because the actual preparation of an interview is quite a lot. You've not only to prepare the content, you may have to buy new clothes, you may have to take a day off work to get yourself, get a dry run and get prepared for this. So just think about, why am I doing this? Why does it matter to me? And then based on how much it matters to me, how much actual time, preparation and effort will I devote for this? And that all should really happen before you even get into the nuts and bolts of, I'm taking Sunday out to prepare for it, or I'm taking 2 days, or whatever it is. They're the sort of early mindset pieces.
And nerves are a very real impediment to a good performance, Yvonne. How can we overcome nerves ahead of an interview?
I mean, nerves can be an impediment, but there's a sort of funny thing about these very strong experiences when they're in the way of something. The rule of thumb is, don't pretend you're not having them, because if you fight them or you try to cover them up, they actually will impede your performance in a greater way. It's actually sort of ironically about trying to find as much space as you can. And there are really two rules of thumb on this. One is practice, 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 because the more you practice, the more confident and the more fluid and flexible will be your output. And that in and of itself will actually counteract the nerves, to some extent. Then the other thing is just recognizing, okay, so I am going to be nervous. It's quite natural. What is it that you're going to do to compensate for the nerves that you are going to have? I mean, things like wearing comfortable clothes, making sure you've got water with you, making sure that you have a layer that you can actually take off on the day if you get too hot.
So physically, Yvonne, you can prepare yourself by dressing comfortably and having a glass of water. Mentally, practice, practice, practice. What about during the interview, though? If those nerves start to overwhelm you, sometimes people worry they draw a blank or just completely lose track of their thoughts. How do you handle that then?
I think, again, the first thing is just to say, for example, okay, I wonder, would you mind repeating that question? Oh, I've completely drawn a blank on that. Or could I just take a second here? I mean, there are things like, just, you have some control over the speed of the interview. You can slow an interview down by just taking a deep breath, just taking a little sip and just saying, okay, I completely lost my train of thought there. I wonder if you could repeat that question, or could you say, okay, if I understand your question correctly, it seems like you are asking me X. And then the whole process really, A, gets slowed down, and B, it gets sort of brought under your control much more. And when you do that, when you get a sense of control over it and you do slow the pace down, you are much less likely to be cognitively challenged and more likely to be able to fully engage. If you don't hear something properly or you didn't really get it, definitely do not pretend that you did, because that they will notice that and you will only get yourself more accelerated. It's better to say, okay, give me a second here. I just need a sip of water and then I'll answer that question again. Or please, would you mind repeating it? No one minds. They would prefer that than have you rush through a half-baked answer that you're only going to regret because you just didn't hear it properly.
Yvonne, there's considerable pressure that comes with the role of a consultant or specialist registrar. So I'm sure in an interview, the personal well-being of the candidate and their approach to achieving balance is something that a panel might query. So what would your advice be on that?
A really strong, healthy answer really has two parts. And one will be to say, work-life balance is very important to me, and I'm going to put systems in place. I mean, all of these high-level roles, they require systems, but you also need to have systems to manage yourself in that role. So I think a really strong answer is to say, I'm taking this very seriously, and I'm adopting quite a systematic approach to it. And that will involve putting in systems such as not allowing the boundaries really between my work and my home life to get very, very blurred, for example. And that would be my advice generally, would be along those lines about what to do. But I think what interview panels really want to know is that you are going to be steady enough to go the pace of a job like that, and that you are actually going to take your mental health as seriously as you're going to take the job. So it isn't about, I think, giving the impression that you'll do absolutely everything it takes. It's about saying, listen, there are now two parts of my life. There is my personal life and there is my working life, and I'm going to value them both equally, and I'm going to, as much as I can, actually keep them separate. So I think it isn't about pleasing the interview panel. I think it's about impressing them with your strength of answer and with a very systematic approach to this part of your job, as you would do to all the other parts of your job.
And then moving away from the interview, Yvonne, so when somebody is in the role of consultant or specialist registrar, what are those systems, or how do you advise they manage that well-being when dealing with difficult and emotive caseloads?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the first point is a very simple one. I think as much as you can, keep the context of your personal life separate from the context of your working life. And I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. I mean, if you have paperwork to do, then don't do it at home. Do it at work, because that, for me, sort of blurs or contaminates the boundary between working and home life. If you have to check mail at home or you have to take calls, try to take them always at a specific time. Again, it's about keeping the red line up so that psychologically you know that when you're working, and that when you're not working, you're not working. And the thing about that psychologically is that when you're not working, you are then revitalizing, you are resting, you are recovering. And so your sort of energy reserves and your strength reserves are actually being added to. If you blur those boundaries, home isn't restorative. And then the demands of the job psychologically, and it could be just the way you're doing it, not the job itself, the demands of the job just will constantly deplete you, because you never get that recuperation and that restoration that your personal life actually will provide for you. And you see that in burnout work and in burnout evidence. It's about keeping those lines between work and between personal restoration, recreation, and growth, keeping them separate. And actually, if you keep them separate, you actually find that you'll have more energy on the job because you were resting and relaxing at home. So it's really about keeping the red lines drawn. So for example, when you come home from work and you talk to your family about the type of day you had, limit the length of time that you do that in. Don't let it sort of spill out into the whole evening. But if you are struggling with a difficult case and you would like to talk, for example, to your partner about that, allocate a specific time and say, I'm really struggling at work. I wonder, could we talk about it perhaps at the evening or at the weekend or whatever? Again, it's like it boxes it into a specific time where you can get the support you need, where that support is scaffolding around your routine. But there isn't this constant drip where you don't know the difference between energy output and restoration. So it's about keeping those red lines in place and about knowing the difference between work and restoration.
Yvonne, thank you so much. Thanks for listening to episode 3 of the Pfizer Pro podcast. Don't forget, a step-by-step e-learning video which builds on the skills and advice outlined in this series is now available on pfizerpro.ie. Thanks for listening.